They called her the geologist. They called her slow. Behind her back, where they thought the mountain winds would carry the words away, they called her fat and useless. They saw a woman who did not fit, a soft shape in a world of hard edges, and they judged her with the brutal simplicity of men whose lives depended on strength. They were wrong. They were wrong about the woman, and they were wrong about the mountain. They thought the mountain was their fortress, a dead thing of rock and ice. They did not know it was a weapon, and when the enemy turned that weapon against them, the arrogant captain with his textbook tactics was silenced, his command broken. In the sudden screaming silence of failure, it was the geologist who stood up. It was the woman they had dismissed who saw the truth written in the stone, who heard the enemy's plan in the vibration of the earth, and who brought the mountain down upon their foes with the cold, precise calculus of a god. They learned her name that day, but it was not the one on her civilian credentials. It was the one whispered in the darkest corners of the world, a name that meant she was not just a warrior, but a force of nature herself. The silence of FOB Erebus was a physical weight. It pressed down from the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, a granite fist clenched against the sky. The air, thin and sharp at 12,000 feet, carried the scent of diesel fumes, ozone from the humming comms array, and the deep, sterile cold of ancient rock. It was a silence composed of 1,000 smaller sounds that the ear learned to filter. The ceaseless moan of the wind across shattered ridgelines, the distant groan of a glacier, the rhythmic crunch of a lone guard's boots on frozen gravel. To the Marines of Echo Company, this was the sound of waiting for an enemy they rarely saw, a ghost that used the terrain as both shield and sword. The silence was a coiled thing, a predator biding its time. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, a pressurized container smelling of stale coffee and nervous sweat, Dr. Eris Thorne felt the silence differently. To her, it was not empty. It was a symphony of data. Her station was a quiet island in the low-level chaos of the TOC. 3 monitors glowed with seismographic data, displaying elegant, spidery lines that charted the mountain's heartbeat. She was not a Marine. Her uniform was a set of practical, insulated fatigues in a slate gray that marked her as an outsider, a civilian attachment from the United States Geological Survey, or so her paperwork claimed. Her build was solid, broad through the shoulders and hips, a frame built for power and endurance rather than the lean, wiry aesthetic of the infantrymen around her. Her hands, resting on the keyboard, were steady and sure, her focus absolute. She was tracing a microfracture pattern deep within the gneiss bedrock, a subtle anomaly that felt like a whisper in a language only she and the mountain understood. She registered movement at the edge of her perception, a shift in the TOC's atmosphere, a change in barometric pressure caused by a large man entering a small space with unearned velocity. Captain Valerius. He did not walk. He strode, his boots striking the metal floor with an aggressive rhythm that demanded attention. He was a man carved from the Marine Corps recruiting poster ideal, a jawline like a spade, a neck thick with muscle, and an aura of loud, polished confidence that grated on the high-altitude quiet. He moved through the TOC like a storm front, his voice a blunt instrument used to hammer the world into a shape he understood. "Status report," he boomed, though he stood less than 5 feet from the comms specialist. His eyes swept the room, not to gather information, but to assert dominance. They landed on Eris, and the corner of his mouth tightened in a familiar sneer of contempt. He saw a civilian, a woman, a soft body occupying space that should belong to a warrior. He saw a liability. He saw everything except the truth. Eris did not look up. Her gaze remained fixed on the central monitor, where a new tremor, infinitesimally small, had just registered. It was asynchronous, unnatural, a discord in the mountain's song. Her fingers moved, tapping a command, isolating the signal's frequency. It was too regular, too rhythmic to be geological. It was a pulse, manufactured. Her own pulse remained a steady 60 beats per minute. The external world, with its loud captains and posturing Marines, was merely another data stream to be analyzed, prioritized, and, if necessary, disregarded. The tension between them had been a low-grade hum since his arrival a week prior, a static charge in the air of the command tent. He was a man of kinetic solutions, of overwhelming firepower and direct action. He saw the world as a series of targets to be acquired and neutralized. Her world was one of resonant frequencies, isostatic rebound, and the slow, inexorable violence of tectonic plates. He believed the mountain was a backdrop for his war. She knew the mountain was a participant. This friction found its flashpoint 2 days later. The wind had picked up, a keening gale that scoured the FOB with ice crystals and made communication between perimeter posts a shouted, desperate affair. Eris had been at her console for 18 straight hours, sustained by protein bars and a cold, clear focus. She had isolated the unnatural pulse. It was a series of low-frequency vibrations, almost undetectable, originating from a deep valley to the northeast. They were mapping, she realized, using the echoes to build a three-dimensional image of the bedrock beneath the base. They were looking for weaknesses. Captain Valerius chose that moment to conduct one of his impromptu inspections, his presence filling the cramped space of the TOC. He saw her, still at her post, surrounded by the glowing green lines he dismissed as meaningless squiggles. He strode over, the metal floor groaning under his weight. He planted his hands on her console, leaning into her space, his shadow falling across her screens. The scent of cheap aftershave and aggression filled the air. "Dr. Thorne," he began, his voice dripping with condescending patience. The word doctor was an insult in his mouth, a synonym for useless intellectual. "Still staring at your little TV shows? Has the mountain told you any of its secrets yet?" A few of the younger Marines snickered. Sergeant Cole, a quiet, competent man who ran the comms rig, pointedly turned his back, busying himself with a diagnostic check that did not need running. He had seen the intensity of the geologist's focus, and it looked more like a sniper sighting a target than a scientist reading a chart. Eris slowly lifted her gaze from the screen to meet his. Her eyes were a pale, arctic gray, and they held no anger, no fear, no emotion at all. They were the eyes of a camera recording data. "They are using seismic resonance to map the substrate of this plateau, Captain. The pulses are patterned. They are searching for unconsolidated glacial till and shear zones." Her response was a flat statement of fact, delivered in a low, even tone. It was devoid of the deference his rank demanded, and this infuriated him more than any open defiance could. He wanted her to be intimidated. Instead, she was treating him like an atmospheric disturbance. He straightened up, puffing out his chest. "In English, Doctor, for those of us who actually fight wars instead of writing papers about them." "What are you babbling about?" His voice was louder now, playing to the audience in the tent. "Is this another one of your ghost stories? First, you say the rocks are talking. Now you're saying the enemy has, what, Magic dirt reading machines. He gestured dismissively at her screens. I have real-world intelligence. We have thermal signatures in the Korangal Pass. We have intercepted chatter about a supply convoy. That is actionable intel. This, he tapped her monitor with a thick finger, leaving a greasy smudge on the screen, is a waste of bandwidth and taxpayer money. Frankly, I don't know what command was thinking, saddling me with a civilian analyst who looks like she'd fail a basic fitness test. You are a distraction, useless. The word hung in the air, thick and ugly. Useless. It was the ultimate condemnation in this world. It was a death sentence. The snickering from the junior Marines stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The captain had crossed a line, turning a professional disagreement into a personal, public humiliation. Eris's expression did not change. She took a microfiber cloth from a pouch on her belt and carefully, deliberately, wiped the smudge from her screen. She did not look at him. She looked at the data. The enemy pulse had just changed frequency, shifting to a higher, more energetic wavelength. They were no longer mapping. They were transmitting. They were preparing to act. The thermal signatures in the pass are a diversion, Captain, she said, her voice still unnervingly calm. So is the chatter. They want you to send a patrol into that valley. She pointed a steady finger at a topographical map overlay on her third screen. They have identified a significant talus slope with a high water content at its base, directly above the trail. A simple percussive charge, or even a focused acoustic signal at the right frequency, will liquefy the basal sediment. It will trigger a debris flow, not a simple rock slide. It would be inescapable. It is a kill box, a geological trap. Valerius stared at her, his face flushing a deep, angry red. She had not only defied him, she had dismantled his intelligence and presented a counter-argument with absolute certainty. She had done it calmly, logically, and without a single concession to his authority. He felt his control over the room slipping, being replaced by her quiet, immovable competence. That is the most absurd, convoluted piece of science fiction nonsense I have ever heard, he snarled. You think you know more about tactics than a Marine captain? You, a geologist? He leaned in close again, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. You are on my FOB, Doctor. You will remember that. You are a guest who has long since overstayed her welcome. Stay out of my way. Stay away from my tactical decisions, or I will have you confined to your quarters for the remainder of your tour for interfering with military operations. Do you understand me? He did not wait for an answer. He spun on his heel and stalked toward the tactical map at the center of the TOC. Sergeant, he barked at a young NCO. Prep Lieutenant Davison's squad. Full combat load. We're moving on that thermal intel in the pass. I want eyes on that convoy route before sunrise. The sergeant glanced nervously from the captain to the silent woman at the seismic console. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Now, Sergeant, Valerius roared. Yes, sir, the sergeant snapped, his training overriding his instinct. He hurried out of the TOC. Eris watched him go. Then she turned back to her screen. The high-frequency pulse from the enemy's position intensified. It was no longer a probe. It was a charge. They were priming the weapon. She looked at the clock in the corner of her display. She calculated the travel time for the patrol to reach the kill zone, the resonance time for the acoustic trigger to achieve liquefaction, and the probable velocity of the resulting debris flow. The equation that formed in her mind was stark, simple, and horrifying. The patrol had less than 2 hours to live. The captain had just sentenced 12 men to death, and he was too arrogant to even know it. The mountain was about to speak, and Valerius had refused to listen. The first sign that the world was coming undone was not a sound, but a feeling. A low, pervasive thrum that vibrated up through the soles of their boots, through the metal floor of the TOC, and into the base of the skull. It was a feeling of deep, resonant wrongness. The lights in the container flickered, and a fine dust of ice crystals and rock powder sifted down from the ceiling vents. The air itself seemed to hum, charged with a terrible energy. On Aris's screen, the elegant lines of the seismograph had become a frantic, jagged scrawl. The mountain was screaming. Then came the sound. It was not the sharp crack of an explosion or the familiar roar of an artillery shell. It was a sound that felt older, more elemental. It was the groan of 1 billion tons of rock and ice being torn from its foundations. It started as a low-frequency growl that was felt more than heard, a beast stirring in the belly of the earth. It rose in pitch and volume to a deafening, grinding crescendo that blotted out all other noise. It was the sound of the world breaking. "What in God's name was that?" Valerius yelled, stumbling as the TOC itself swayed on its foundations. He grabbed the edge of the central map table for balance, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. His eyes were wide, searching for a familiar threat. An incoming rocket, a mortar barrage, but finding none. "That," Aris said, her voice cutting through the din with chilling precision, "was the debris flow I warned you about." Her hands were a blur across her keyboard, her focus absolute. The screens before her painted a picture of utter catastrophe. The entire south face of the Korangal Pass had collapsed. The energy release was equivalent to a small tactical nuclear device. Lieutenant Davison's patrol, the 12 men Valerius had sent into the trap, were not just dead. They were gone, erased from existence, buried under 100 feet of rock and liquefied earth. Before Valerius could process this, before he could even formulate a denial, the second phase of the attack began. A series of sharp whip-crack reports echoed from the cliffs directly overlooking the FOB. Not one sound, but dozens in rapid succession. High-frequency acoustic drivers, Aris's mind supplied instantly. They're targeting the immediate perimeter. The result was instantaneous. The precarious ledges of rock and scree that surrounded the base, the very terrain the Marines had used to build their defensive positions, gave way. Sentry posts vanished in localized, terrifyingly precise landslides. The heavy machine gun nest on the western ridge, the FOB's primary defensive asset, tilted, slid, and then plunged into a newly opened chasm with a final grinding shriek of metal. The earth around the base was being systematically dismantled. "Report!" Valerius screamed into his handset, but only a burst of static answered him. "Comms are down! Get them back up!" he roared at Sergeant Cole. Cole was already working, his face pale, but his hands steady. "Negative, Captain. The main comms tower just sheared off at the base. The repeater array on the high ridge is gone too. We're cut off." Panic began to curdle the air in the TOC. This was not an attack they had trained for. There were no muzzle flashes to return fire on, no enemy combatants to engage. Their fortress had become a cage, and the bars of that cage were collapsing inward. Valerius, stripped of his ability to call for air support or communicate with his platoons, was reduced to a state of impotent fury. His entire tactical doctrine was based on a conventional battlefield that no longer existed. He fell back on the only thing he knew: brute force. All remaining personnel, secure the inner perimeter, he bellowed, his voice cracking with strain. Form a defensive circle around the TOC and the barracks. Return fire on any target you can identify. A young Marine, his face chalky with fear, cried out. Return fire on what, sir? The rocks? The question was an admission of their complete helplessness. Valerius's strategy was a child's response to a nightmare, screaming into the dark. He was trying to fight a tectonic event with rifles. His orders were not just useless, they were actively harmful, pulling men from the relative safety of reinforced structures and exposing them to the collapsing environment. He was failing, systemically, catastrophically. And in the stark, unforgiving light of the emergency strobes, everyone in the TOC could see it. His authority, built on a foundation of bluster and rank, was crumbling as surely as the mountain around them. The third wave of the attack was the most insidious. It was not a physical assault, but a digital one. Aris saw it first. A cascade of error messages flooded her secondary monitor, a diagnostic screen she kept linked to the FOB's internal network. The enemy wasn't just isolating them physically, they were slicing them apart virtually. They've breached the network, she announced, her tone clinical, as if describing a weather pattern. They used the chaos of the initial attack as cover. They're not trying to steal data. They're injecting a recursive algorithm into the power grid controller. Valerius spun to face her, his eyes wild. What does that mean? He demanded, his voice raw. It means, she said, her fingers flying as she attempted to build a firewall from scratch, that in approximately 90 seconds they will trigger a cascading overload of the base's generators. The system will attempt to shut down, but the algorithm will force a restart. The cycle will repeat, creating a power surge of increasing magnitude. The final surge will be strong enough to detonate the primary fuel depot. She did not need to elaborate. The fuel depot was located less than 50 meters from the barracks and the aid station. Its detonation would not just cripple the base, it would obliterate it. It was a checkmate move, elegant and utterly ruthless. The enemy had used geology to isolate them, acoustics to dismantle their defenses, and now cyber warfare to deliver the killing blow. Valerius stared at her, his mind unable to grasp the multiple, intersecting vectors of the assault. He was a hammer, and this was not a nail. It was a web. He was silent. For the first time since he had arrived, Captain Valerius had no orders to give. He was paralyzed. The arrogant authority had failed. The system had broken. The room was filled with the sound of grinding rock, the scream of the wind, and the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a digital clock counting down to their extinction. The crisis was absolute. In the sudden, profound vacuum of command, all eyes turned to the one person in the room who was not panicking, the one person who was still working. Dr. Eris Thorne pushed herself back from her console, her chair scraping on the vibrating floor. She stood, and the movement, simple and deliberate, drew the focus of every soul in the TOC. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, carving her solid frame out of the gloom. She was no longer an anomaly, a civilian outsider. In the face of systemic failure, she had become the only point of stability in a world that was shaking itself apart. She walked to the central communications hub, her steps even and unhurried, despite the tremor shaking the very air. Sergeant Cole looked up at her, his hands frozen over a dead console. He saw a calmness in her gray eyes that defied the chaos, a deep, cold certainty that was more commanding than any shouted order. She was not seizing command. Authority was flowing to her, a natural consequence of physics, like water seeking the lowest point. Her competence was now the only relevant metric of power. "Sergeant Cole," she said, her voice quiet but carrying with absolute clarity over the cacophony. "I need you to bypass the network controller. Slave the mortar team's targeting computer directly to my seismic sensor array. Use a hardline connection. The wireless spectrum is compromised." The order was bizarre, counterintuitive. It made no tactical sense in any conventional framework. Valerius, jarred from his stupor, finally found his voice. "A mortar? What are you going to do, shell a mountain? I am still in command here, Doctor, and I will not have you." Iris did not even turn to look at him. She spoke to Cole, her focus unwavering. "The enemy's acoustic drivers are powered by a central source. To generate that much focused energy, they need a massive capacitor bank and a transmitter, likely housed together. The entire system is creating a sympathetic frequency, a vibration that is unique and identifiable. My sensors can pinpoint that frequency's origin to within 5 meters. We are not targeting the enemy. We are targeting their machine." Cole stared at her for a heartbeat. He looked from her calm, analytical face to the sputtering, furious face of his captain. He had a choice: follow the loud, broken authority of rank or the quiet, compelling logic of this strange, brilliant woman. He had seen her predictions come true with devastating accuracy. He had seen his captain sentence 12 men to death through sheer arrogance. The choice was not a choice at all. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the word ma'am a quiet, revolutionary act. He turned to his console and began yanking cables, his movements suddenly filled with a desperate purpose. He was no longer following orders. He was joining a solution. Aris turned to 2 other Marines who were huddled near the doorway, their rifles held uselessly in their hands. "You two, I need a single 120mm high explosive mortar round, but I need it modified. Take it to the EOD tent. I need you to remove 90% of the explosive filler. Replace it with rock salt, sand, anything inert you can find. I need mass, not blast. The detonation needs to be just strong enough to crack the casing and deliver the payload. A kinetic impactor, not a bomb. Go, now." They looked at Valerius, a last flicker of ingrained obedience. He stood there, his mouth open, speechless. He was an officer of the United States Marine Corps, and he was being rendered irrelevant in his own command center. The 2 Marines saw his paralysis, then looked back at Aris. They saw her certainty. They nodded, turned, and ran from the TOC, a new mission burning in their eyes. The transfer of power was complete. It had been a bloodless coup, waged not with weapons, but with competence. The turn was made. With the others gone on their tasks, Aris returned to her console. A red timer in the corner of her screen showed 45 seconds until the power grid overload. Cole was working furiously behind her, patching the hardline. "Connection established," he grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mortar targeting is slaved to your system." On her main screen, the seismic data was now overlaid with a topographical map. A single bright red point pulsed in a deep ravine 3 kilometers to the north. The source of the enemy's power, the heart of the beast. She began inputting calculations, her fingers a blur. She was not just accounting for distance and elevation. She was factoring in wind speed, air density, the Coriolis effect, and most critically, the geological composition of the target area. She was aiming at a point in space, but her true target was a point in the Earth. The enemy command node is located at the base of a stratified cliff face, she said, speaking as much to herself as to Cole. The layers are limestone, shale, and a deep stratum of weathered granite. The acoustic resonance has destabilized the shale layer, creating microscopic fractures throughout. It's primed, like a pane of glass that's been scored with a diamond. The two Marines burst back into the TOC, carrying the modified mortar round. It looked the same, but it was now a different kind of weapon. "It's done," one of them panted. "Give it to the mortar team," Eris commanded without looking up. "Firing coordinates are being transmitted now. Tell them to fire on my mark, exactly on my mark." 20 seconds on the timer. Valerius finally moved. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out as if to physically stop her. "You don't know what you're doing," he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "This is insane. You're wasting our last shot on a rock." Eris finished her calculations. The firing solution glowed green. She keyed her comm, patching directly to the mortar pit. "Fire," she said, her voice a flat, cold instrument of command. 10 seconds on the timer. A distant, muffled thump echoed through the storm, the sound of the mortar leaving the tube. It was a tiny sound in the midst of the mountain's roar, a single raindrop in a hurricane. On the screen, a timer began, counting the shell's flight. It was a 37-second flight. For 37 seconds, the fate of FOB Erebus would hang suspended in the thin, cold air. A piece of metal packed with sand and salt, arcing through the sky on a trajectory calculated by a woman the captain had called useless. The final surge from the enemy's algorithm was just seconds away. It was a race, a perfect, terrible, beautiful race. The world held its breath for 37 seconds. Inside the TOC, the only sounds were the howling wind outside and the quiet, rhythmic beeping of the shell's tracking icon as it crossed the map. The timer for the power grid overload flashed red, showing 5 seconds remaining. 4, 3. Eris watched her central monitor, her expression as placid as a frozen lake. She was not watching the tactical map, but the seismograph. She was not waiting for an explosion. She was waiting for an echo. 2, 1. The overload timer hit 0. At the exact same instant, the mortar's tracking icon blinked over the target. There was no massive explosion visible on the horizon, no satisfying fireball that would have vindicated Captain Valerius's worldview. There was only a faint, almost imperceptible pop carried on the wind. It was an anticlimax, a failure. Valerius let out a choked, triumphant laugh. "Nothing! You did nothing! You've killed us all!" But Aris's eyes were locked on the seismograph. A new line had appeared, a sharp, vertical spike, the kinetic impact, the energy of the modified shell, carrying the mass of sand and salt, had struck the scored cliff face, not with a blast, but with a focused, percussive shockwave. It was not a hammer blow, it was the tap of a chisel on a fault line. The energy propagated downward, through the limestone and into the already fractured shale layer. Paragraph E. On her screen, she watched the results. The microscopic fissures in the shale vibrated to the breaking point by the enemy's own acoustic weapon, now connected. A chain reaction. The entire stratum of rock, a shelf 100 meters wide and 20 meters thick, lost its integrity in a single, silent moment. Then, gravity took over. The sound that followed was not an explosion. It was the deep, final sigh of the mountain, a low, guttural roar that dwarfed everything that had come before. The entire cliff face detached. Thousands of tons of rock, a solid, unstoppable mass, fell directly downward. It did not slide. It plunged. It struck the ravine floor where the enemy command node was located, burying it, the capacitor bank, the transmitter, and everyone operating it under 200 feet of solid geology. It was a tombstone delivered with pinpoint precision. The effect was instantaneous. The low-frequency hum that had permeated the air for hours ceased as if a switch had been thrown. The chaotic, jagged lines on the seismograph smoothed out, returning to the gentle, rhythmic pulse of a mountain at peace. The recursive algorithm in the power grid, its source signal severed, died. The lights in the TOC flickered once, twice, and then burned steady and bright. The shaking stopped. A profound, almost holy silence descended upon FOB Erebus. The wind still howled, but it was just wind now, not a harbinger of doom. The enemy's coordinated, multifaceted assault was over. The threat was not just neutralized, it was annihilated, erased from the board. A checkmate delivered not with a bullet, but with a rock. The Marines in the TOC stared at the screens, then at Eris. They looked at her as if she were a witch, a shaman who had spoken to the mountain and commanded it to fight on their behalf. They had witnessed an act of war so sophisticated, so alien to their own methods, that it bordered on the supernatural. Sergeant Cole slowly sank into his chair, running a trembling hand over his face. He was a man who had seen combat in Fallujah and Helmand, but he had never seen anything like this. This was a different kind of power, cold, intellectual, absolute. Valerius stood frozen, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Disbelief, fury, and a dawning, sickening horror as the scale of his misjudgment became clear to him. He had been so utterly, completely wrong. This woman, this civilian he had mocked and dismissed, had just saved them all with a single, elegant, impossible maneuver. His world, with its clear hierarchies and simple, violent truths, had been turned inside out. Into the stunned silence, a new sound intruded. A crackle of static from the main comms console, the one they had all thought was dead. A voice, clear and cold, cut through the static. It was not a standard battlefield communication. It was a tightly encrypted channel, one reserved for the highest levels of command. Nereid, this is Triton Actual. Report status. Our telemetry shows the seismic event, but we have lost the hostile signal. Did you neutralize the threat? The voice was calm, expectant. It was not asking if the FOB had survived. It was asking if the mission was complete. And it was not addressed to Captain Valerius. It was addressed to a call sign none of them had ever heard. Nereid. Sergeant Cole, his training kicking in, automatically reached for the handset. Unidentified station, this is FOB Erebus Command. Identify yourself. Before he could speak, Eris held up a hand. She walked over to the console and took the handset from his grasp. Her movements were fluid, economical. She was no longer just a geologist. A new authority settled over her, an invisible mantle of command that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Triton Actual, this is Nereid, she said into the handset, her voice crisp and formal. The asset has been neutralized. We use their own resonance weapon to trigger a targeted geological event. Complete structural collapse of their C2 node. Zero chance of survival or data recovery. The test was successful. The environmental weaponization tactic is viable, but vulnerable to countermeasure. Valerius stared, his mind reeling. Asset, test. The words made no sense. This was not a battle for survival. This was an experiment. And they, his FOB, his Marines, had been the lab rats. The voice on the other end, Triton Actual, replied. Understood, Nereid. Excellent work. Your analysis was, as always, flawless. There was a pause. We also registered the loss of a Marine patrol just prior to the main event. Was that part of your plan? Eris's gray eyes flicked toward Valerius. For the first time, a flicker of something cold and hard entered her gaze. It was not anger. It was judgment. Negative, Triton. The loss of the patrol was an unsanctioned deviation by the local commander. His tactical assessment was flawed. He disregarded my threat analysis and sent his men into a kill zone I had explicitly identified. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. When the voice returned, all traces of professional calm were gone, replaced by a razor's edge of cold fury. Put him on. Eris held the handset out to Valerius. Her face was unreadable, a mask of stone. The captain looked at the black piece of plastic as if it were a venomous snake. His bravado, his arrogance, his entire identity as a Marine officer was gone, stripped away by a few sentences over a secure channel. He was exposed, a failure on a scale he had never imagined possible. Trembling, he took the handset. "This is Captain Valerius," he said, his own voice sounding weak and alien to him. "Captain," the voice of Triton Actual sliced through the speaker, so cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "This is Colonel Madsen, Joint Special Operations Command. Do you have any idea what you have done? You were assigned to provide logistical support and perimeter security for a Tier 1 asset on a mission of critical national importance. Your sole function was to observe and protect Dr. Thorne. Instead, you interfered. You dismissed her intelligence. Intelligence, I might add, that comes from the single foremost expert on geological and unconventional warfare on this planet. You ignored a direct threat assessment and sent 12 United States Marines to their deaths for no other reason than your own monumental ego. You not only compromised a multi-billion-dollar intelligence operation, you wasted the lives of men under your command. You are hereby relieved of your command, effective immediately. You are confined to your quarters under armed guard. You will speak to no one. A tribunal will be waiting for you when we pull you out of that hole. Is that clear?" Valerius could not speak. A dry, rasping sound came from his throat. He nodded, a pathetic, jerking motion. The handset slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. The connection was cut. He stood there in the center of the TOC, a hollow man in a captain's uniform. Broken. Colonel Madsen's words echoed in the silent room. The single foremost expert on geological and unconventional warfare on this planet. The Marines looked at Eris, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming woman they had mocked with the legendary figure described by the colonel. Dr. Thorne was a cover, a lie. The truth was standing right in front of them, and it was terrifying. She was not a scientist who knew about war. She was a warrior who had mastered science as a weapon. The revelation hung in the air, recontextualizing everything. Her quiet observations, her strange data, her calm demeanor under fire. It had not been the detachment of a civilian. It had been the focus of an elite professional, operating so far beyond their understanding that they had not even recognized it for what it was. Her physical build, which they had derided as soft, was now seen for what it was: the dense, powerful frame of a special operator built for carrying heavy loads over impossible terrain, a body conditioned for endurance, not for show. They had called her useless. They had been looking at a goddess of war and seen only a librarian. The shame of their ignorance was a palpable thing, a bitter taste in the back of their throats. The aftermath of the battle was defined by a new kind of silence, the silence of awe. The hierarchy of the FOB had been shattered and then rebuilt along a new, more fundamental axis: competence. Rank was meaningless. The only thing that mattered was the quiet woman who now sat back at her seismic console, analyzing the aftershocks of the landslide she had created. She showed no triumph, no satisfaction in Valerius's downfall. His failure was simply a data point in her mission assessment. She was already moving on, her mind processing the event, refining her models, preparing for the next threat. Two Marines, their faces grim, appeared at the captain's side. Without a word, they took his arms and escorted him from the TOC. He did not resist. He moved like a man in a dream, his eyes empty. The door hissed shut behind him, sealing his disgrace. A new order had been established, not by a formal declaration, but by the undeniable demonstration of merit. The FOB now belonged to Commander Thorne. The remaining men found reasons to be busy, avoiding her gaze, unsure how to act in her presence. They spoke in hushed tones, the previous easy barracks camaraderie replaced by a fearful respect. They were in the presence of something they did not understand, and it made them profoundly uneasy. They had been part of a battle, but she had been fighting a war on a level they could not comprehend. Later, as the first hints of dawn began to bruise the eastern sky, Sergeant Cole approached her station. He moved quietly, deliberately. In his hands, he held a steaming metal mug. He did not speak. He simply placed the mug of coffee on the edge of her console, next to her keyboard. It was a simple gesture, an offering, a quiet acknowledgement of the new reality. It was not praise for her victory, but respect for her craft. It was an apology from a man who knew he should have recognized her quality sooner. Eris Thorne did not look up from her screen for a long moment. Then she slowly reached out, her fingers wrapping around the warm mug. She lifted it and took a slow sip. Her eyes met Cole's over the rim of the cup. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the acknowledgement he needed. He nodded back, then returned to his own station, the transaction complete. A bridge had been built between their two worlds, a quiet understanding forged in crisis. An hour later, a new sound filled the air, the distinctive heavy thrum of a CV-22 Osprey, its rotors beating a powerful rhythm against the thin air. It was not a standard medevac or resupply bird. It was a specialized aircraft, painted a flat, non-reflective black, devoid of any markings. It did not land in the designated area. It hovered 20 feet above the roof of the TOC, its engines roaring, kicking up a storm of ice and gravel. A winch line snaked down from its belly. Eris stood, gathered a single, small, hardened data drive from her console, and walked to the door of the TOC. She paused and looked back at Cole. "You have command until the relief officer arrives," she said. "Keep your men off the ridges. The geology here is still unstable." And with that, she was gone. She walked out into the rotor wash, a solitary gray figure against the vast, broken landscape. She clipped the harness to her belt without breaking stride, and the winch pulled her upward into the belly of the black aircraft. The Osprey did not linger. It tilted its rotors forward and accelerated into the dawn sky, disappearing behind a snow-dusted peak. She had arrived as a mystery and departed as a legend, leaving behind a humbled command, a dozen ghosts in a valley of rock, and a profound lesson written in the stone itself. She was a ghost, a whisper in the high places of the world. Her legacy was not written in medals or citations, but in the silent, awestruck faces of the men she left behind at FOB Erebus. They would tell the story for the rest of their careers, a cautionary tale about a quiet geologist who brought a mountain to its knees. The story would become a myth, embellished and altered in the telling, but its core truth would remain: that true authority is not conferred by rank, but earned through competence. That the most dangerous weapon is not a rifle, but a mind that can see the hidden fractures in the world, and that you should never, ever underestimate the quiet ones. For they are the ones who listen to the silence. And sometimes, when the need is great enough, the silence answers back,